we have to talk a little bit about his youth in England. Sorry, it's headings come a bit. So we had a little bit about this from David Brune earlier. David was born at some time in the 1080s. We can't be more secure than that, though most people think early to mid rather than late 1080s. And he's likely to have spent most of his time in England from his parents' death in 1093, when the family fled south onwards, although it's always possible that he will have returned for short periods in between. Oh, no. No. What are you looking for? Are you trying to get rid of this?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, I see. Oh, clever. Okay, thank you very much. So from 1100, he was brother to the Queen. His sister Edith, who became the wife of Henry I, had changed her name to Matilda because the previous Queen Edith had been Edward the Confessor's queen, who was famously barren, and her lack of children was what caused the Norman conquest. And therefore, Edith was seen as an unlucky name. So she had her name changed to Matilda. It seems to me that a very high proportion of 12th century women are called Matilda. I always advise my students, if they're writing an exam about the 12th century and they can't remember the name of an important woman, they've got a probably more or less 50% chance of getting it right if they just write Matilda. So David becomes his brother to the Queen and therefore brother-in-law to the King. And then about 13 years later, at Christmas in 1113, he's married to another Matilda, who we're calling Maud, which is a short form Matilda, the daughter of Earl Waltheof, whom Neil talked to us about earlier today, and the widow of Simon de Senlis, who was Earl of Huntingdon and Northampton. David's accession may also have been the time at which he becomes the ruler of his Cumbrian Principatus or Principality. And this may have occurred shortly after his marriage. We're not sure about this, but it's likely to have happened then. Now, I think to kind of put this into context and to understand what's going on here, it's useful to look at a parallel, a contemporary parallel, someone who must have been a companion and friend of David. This was Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew by his sister Adela, so again, a close family member connected through the female side. He was probably about a decade younger than David, and he was his parents' fourth son. So like David, he wasn't expected to necessarily inherit through his father's side any great lands. But in 1113, he was granted the honour of Eye in East Anglia. The caput, Eye itself, is in Suffolk, but this was one of those dispersed earldoms like Huntingdon and Northampton that had land scattered over quite a wide area rather than being a kind of territorial block in the way that we think of, say, Scottish earldoms or earldoms on the Welsh March. And at the same time, he was also granted the honour of Lancaster in the northwest of England. And it seems to me that what we're seeing here in late 1113, and this may even have happened at the same Christmas court as David married, we're seeing Henry give two of his relatives on the distaff side, so people who aren't in the line of succession, as he thinks, very large, wealthy Eastern English sets of estates, which will give them a huge income, but also putting them onto northwestern Irish seacoast regions, which are very underdeveloped, which don't have towns, have very little experience of cash economy and so on, and have been only tangentially connected to any of the larger polities, England or indeed the Scottish kingdom at this time. And I think what we're seeing here is Henry I's engaging in the years 1113 to 1114 in a significant movement into the Irish Sea. And so that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about now. In 1113, 1114, Henry I seems to show major interest in the Irish Sea. How do I switch this on?
The orange one. It's switched on, I think. It's just the orange.
Oh, that thing, yes. Okay, so we the honour of Lancaster was basically probably the northern part of Lancashire, this sort of area here. Cumbria, of course, as we've seen, is heading up that way towards Glasgow. And in addition to making Stephen, Lord of Lancaster. In the following year, in 1114, Henry also invaded North Wales here with Alexander I of Scotland. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only time a reigning Scottish king took an army into Wales. So that's quite curious and interesting. One of the things I quite like is that the Welsh language chronicle that tells us about this, the British Tywysogion, describes Alexander as Brenin Prydain, King of Britain, but presumably translating Alba, that they're still thinking of Alba in its classical Irish sense of Britain. Henry and Alexander took the submission of Griffith ap Cynan, who was the king of Gwynedd, which is the area, basically Anglesey and the adjacent mainland. It has fluctuating borders going further east and south, but its core area is Snowdonia and Anglesey and the Llŷn Peninsula. Griffith ap Cynan is an interesting person because he'd been trying to get control of North Wales for a long time, and this is, I think, his fourth period as king of Gwynedd. He'd actually grown up in Dublin, down here, where he'd been educated at Swords, and he was related on his mother's side to the traditional family of the kings of Dublin, and we'll return to that shortly. And he'd been supported by fleets of Hiberno Norse and Islesmen in his various attempts to get control of North Wales. Now, also in this same year of 1113 to 14, and the precise chronology is unclear, Henry was probably involved in regime change in the Kingdom of the Isles, which had its sort of main centre on Man and on Islay, and put in place Olaf of Bittling, who, like David, had grown up at his court and had probably been given as a hostage again in the 1090s. So we can think of David and Stephen and Olaf as three young men who'd spent most of their older childhood and young manhood as household knights of Henry I of England. So if you put all these things together, you can see that Henry is making a major push into this region, trying to control the Irish Sea. And so we have to think about what the context of this is. This is not an area of history that's tended to be investigated in great detail, partly because, as we shall see, it doesn't lead to sort of long-term fruits, but also because there's so many other more interesting things to sort of English historians going on at this time. And there's a tendency to regard the western frontiers of England as less interesting than the southern frontiers of England in medieval history. So the explanation for Henry's interest in this area is in the difficult to pronounce Murdoch O'Brien. He's the King of Munster, and with his kingdom based in Limerick, but he's also, for much of his reign, recognised by foreign rulers and churchmen as the King of Ireland. The Norman conquest had loosened English power in Western Britain. In the last century of pre-conquest English history, from about the time of King Edgar, who famously took a fleet around Wales, through to the time of Edward the Confessor, who sent his successor, Harold Godwinson, on an expedition into North Wales that led to major regime change there and the killing of the Welsh king. And Siward of Northumbria expanding into Cumbria. The English polity had a fairly good grip on this region. But after the Norman conquest, interest in this region fell away. The new Norman rulers were quite late arriving on the west coast, and that power vacuum had been filled by the Ivrion dynasty from Munster. So as I say, they're based in Limerick, one of the Hiberno Norse towns on the Shannon, but they'd also got to control considerably more of the island. And Murdoch O'Brien, Henry's rival, had been King of Dublin from 1075 under his father's lordship. So he's probably the person who bankrolled most of Griffith ap Cynan's attempts to become King of North Wales. And from 1094, as King of Ireland, he'd become the dominant ruler in the region. And in 1111, he even made his nephew, Dovnal, son of Taig, King of the Isles. So it's this Dovnal, son of Taig, who is replaced by Olaf Bittling, by Henry I. So Henry is clearly interested in stemming this Irish control. And Henry has a long-term history with Murdoch. Henry of Huntingdon tells us that Murdoch was blockaded by Henry. There was an attempt to make a trade embargo on Ireland because he supported a rebellion by Arnulf of Montgomery, who's sometimes called Earl of Pembroke, which is a title he may or may not have held. It's uncertain whether he's the first Earl or whether he was just a kind of someone who held a lot of land there. He was one of the Anglo-Norman lords who held land in Wales and the west of England. He's related to the Belem dynasty. And his disagreements with King Henry were that he was part of that quite large faction of the Anglo-Norman and Norman nobility who wanted Robert Curthose, the older son of William the Conqueror, to be king. And so it seems we can see a series of rebellions by people like Arnulf of Montgomery and Robert of Belem and others in favour of Robert Curthose, and after Robert is captured in 1108 in favour of his son William Clito, and they're clearly being backed by Murtoch, presumably not because Murtoch O'Brien particularly likes Robert Curthose, but because England's adversity is Ireland's opportunity. That wanting England to be in a chaotic state is to their benefit. And so we have this long-running sort of problematic rivalry, and it's clear that in 1113 to 14, Henry has decided to deal with this. Now here we were not quite sure about causality and the relationship. In 1114, Murtoch was deposed by his brother Diarmait following a wasting sickness that had probably begun the year before. Now, what we're not certain about is whether these events prompted Henry's multi-pronged move into the region, or whether Diarmait's move against his brother was prompted by a defeat by Henry in certain areas. So you could see it working either way. But again, it's clear that things are going badly wrong for Murtoch. Eventually, he does actually win back his kingdom and defeats Diarmait, but he never manages to extend his rule beyond Munster again after this. He's no longer King of Ireland. He's no longer a threat in the wider insular world. Anthony Camden, the Irish historian, has argued that Murtoch's imperium stretched as far as the Lennox and perhaps other parts of what's now southwest Scotland. So we might see that David's Cumbrian Principatus is again part of Henry's policy in confronting Murtoch. Camden's argument is based on a text written in Murtoch's time, the war of the Irish against the Norsemen, or Cogath Gael Gweddel, which is actually dealing at this point with Brian Boru, the famous Brian Boru, and lists the territories that were subject to him. But the territories outside of Ireland are unlikely to have been subject to Brion. There's no real evidence that Brian Boru in 1014 or thereabouts had control of territories outside of Ireland, whereas we do know that Murtoch did. So what Tony Camden has been arguing is that what's being listed are the things that Murtoch, at the time the text is being written, had a claim to rule, and that he's projecting it back to his great-grandfather's time as a way of sort of legitimizing it by saying, well, we're naturally the rulers here. I think I'm right in saying also that this text is the earliest appearance of the name of the Lennox. I don't think it appears in any earlier text. So that's round about 1100. And of course, the Lennox is not very far away. It's over there, isn't it? You can see this was kind of a major sort of regional confrontation. Because Murtoch's brief period of empire from the 1090s through to about 1114 didn't really lead to anything, we tend to forget about it. But if you're alive at the time, a sort of 20-year period like that can seem quite significant. You know, remember that the Nazi regime only lasted 11.5 years, the same length of time as the average Pictish king's reign. So, yeah, so yet we think that that was quite a significant event. And so we can see Murtoch as appearing to people in Britain and Ireland as a clear and present danger. In Scottish historiography, he's mostly known for the fact that Edgar, King of Scotland, one of David's older brothers, sent him a camel in either 1104 or 1105, we're not sure which. One of the, I think the modern edition of the Chronicle by Sean Maher has a footnote under the word camel, and it says possibly an elephant was met. And you look across at the Middle Irish, think, well, I wonder what is this confusing word that might mean elephant, and it says camel. So unfortunately, Sean McCart is dead, so I'll never be able to ask him why he thought a camel might be an elephant. Why was an elephant more likely to be a gift from a king of Scotland to a king of Ireland in the early 12th century? Presumably, Edgar had this as a gift from returning crusaders. The Crusades were very much a part of the world. We heard about this a little bit in Carl's paper, but Robert Curthose, the reason that he was overlooked for the throne of England in 1100 is partly that he was on the first crusade at the time, out of the country. And we know that David's uncle, Edgar Atheling, was also on the first crusade. And when Alexander I is making a great gift of land to St. Andrew's Cathedral, he gives his Arab stallion and his Turkish armor to the church as well. So I like to think that Edgar Atheling probably brought back presents for his nephews, including camels and horses and Turkish armor, and that maybe Edgar didn't really like his camel very much, so sent it to Murchach. But in any case, it's so Murchach's fall leads to Henry becoming the dominant power in the Irish Sea region. But Henry's successful imperial ambitions in the Irish Sea and elsewhere fell apart on his death when the Anglo-Norman realm fell into civil war. I know you said we shouldn't call it a civil war, Duncan, sorry. Into anarchy, shall we say. And it's not just England, of course, that Henry had managed to secure control of Normandy in 1108, but this he also loses Normandy, or rather his Normandy is invaded shortly after his reign. Stephen becomes King of England, but Normandy goes first to his brother Theobald and then subsequently to the Angevins. David I was, of course, as is well known, a major beneficiary of this. He was able to expand his control and influence into the northern England and parts of Galloway during this period. And we've heard about his, from Carl, about his use of Carlisle as effectively some sort of capital. It's also likely that he took over Henry's role as protector of some of Henry's clients in the region. It's worth noting that Olaf Bittlinger was killed by dynastic rivals a mere 6 weeks after David died, despite having been untroubled for 40 years on the throne. Now, we tend not to think much about Olaf Bittlinger, partly because his Norse name, Bittling, which means little piece or scrap, as many people think he wasn't very significant. But the fact that he rules peacefully for 40 years, and one of the reasons we don't hear much about him is because during his reign, he wasn't very troubled. He didn't fight against dynastic rivals and things. It's probably about the longest period of peace in the Kingdom of the Isles in the whole of its existence. So I think that we've got to think there about what's going on. If we remember that Olaf and David had grown up together at Henry's court, it's almost certainly the case, I think, that put together, we have good circumstantial evidence that Olaf was effectively at this point under David's protection, and that David has taken over, and that's the reason why the dynastic rivalry that's been in the box for 40 years springs out almost immediately. Because if you think about 6 weeks, Olaf's killers, his nephews, came from Dublin. So if you think about the time it will take the news of David's death to reach Dublin, to raise a fleet together, and then to sail to the Isle of Man, that's going to be pretty much immediately that people have started, they'll have done that as quickly as they possibly could. So after Henry, we see these changes. And there are other things as well, and I was thinking about this when during Carl's paper, when there was so much about Carlisle. But of course, one of the other things that we see David doing in 1149 is he has a spring court. I think it's Whitsun, although maybe Easter. I suddenly realised I should have checked this. When the future Henry II, Henry of Anjou, comes to Carlisle to be knighted, and Ranulph, Earl of Chester, also comes to support this new alliance. This is during Henry's sort of beginning of his campaign against Stephen that ends up with the Peace of Wallingford. So this happens in 1149, and it's interesting that it happens here on the Irish Sea coast. Ranulph, Earl of Chester, is probably the most powerful northwest Anglo-Norman baron at this time. He turns up, and there's some evidence as well that David's influence may have extended into North Wales. Griffith ap Cynan had died in 1137, not long after Henry I, And he was succeeded by his son Owain Gwynedd. He's always called Owain Gwynedd because there are two kings called Owain ap Griffith, who reign with almost identical reign lengths in Wales in the same time period. They're the sons of two different Griffiths, and they're kings of different kingdoms, but they're usually known as Owain Gwynedd and Owain Cyfeilion by the name of their kingdom rather than by anything else. So Owain Gwynedd, Griffith ap Cynan's son, ruled from 1137 to 1170. He's the first person to use the title Princeps Waliae to demonstrate that he was more powerful than other Welsh kings. That's what the term Prince of Wales originally meant. And one of his sons, his oldest son, Hywel, is a well-known poet, and there are several poems by Hywel survive. And one of them is a poem about a trip to a king's court in Carlisle. Now, he doesn't name David, but I'd be very surprised if this wasn't actually this 1149 court. It's not a very useful poem because it's actually mostly about girls he met on the way. So it's not as useful historically as it might appear. But it's interesting that the focus of it is this journey through northeast Wales and northwest England into Carlisle. And another of Owain Gwyneth's sons is called Dafydd. Now, Dafydd is, of course, a typical Welsh name, but he's actually the first Welsh person ever to be called Dafydd. Wales famously has Saint David as its patron saint, but he's Dewi Sant. And the traditional Welsh form of the late antique or biblical name David is Dewi. And Dafydd is imported as a new name in the mid-12th century, and the first person to have it is a son of Owain Gwynedd. And I'm pretty certain that he's going to be named for David I of Scotland. So I think we can see that David has inherited Henry's role as the protector of this region, keeping out the Irish and potentially the Scandinavians as well. So that's the sorry. So I've got two screens in front of me, and I keep wanting to move the picture on that one, whereas in fact it's this one. So after David, stability makes a poor story. So most of what I talked about was the changing of power relations under Henry, because under David's rule, this region remains amazingly stable, despite the anarchy of what was going on in England and Normandy. But the stability can be brought out and best marked by the events that followed his death. Soneled of Argyll, who we've just been hearing about, Olaf's son-in-law, immediately invaded Cumbria in support of his nephews, the grandsons of Alexander I, and after his father-in-law's killing, became embroiled in the politics of the Kingdom of the Isles, which after 40 years' stability collapsed into chaotic internecine strife, which continued for another 120 years. There's little evidence of any trouble in these regions during David's reign. And accounts of the Battle of the Standard in 1138 suggest that Islesmen, Gallividians, and the men of Lennox all joined David's Scots and Loudoners under a royal banner. So what I'd like to suggest is that you can see in the first half of the 12th century, the Irish Sea moving between three imperia successively. At the beginning of the century, Murtoch of Munster, Murtoch of Rian, the king of Munster and titular king of Ireland, dominates the region, following on from a number of Irish kings who have been dominating it since the time of the Norman conquest. One of the most interesting, which is Diarmaid Marlborough, where that's a whole other lecture, as people have been saying earlier in the conference. After that, we see Henry aggressively placing relatives and vassals into parts of the region and forcing others, such as Griffith ap Cynan, to change allegiance. And when Henry dies and Anglo-Norman interests focus elsewhere on their own internal struggles, David I takes over that region and the dominance of it. Now, I've not said as much about the Cumbrian role, and that's partly because I knew that Derek and Francis will be talking about southwest Scotland more. But I'm sure that this is part of it, because part of that greater Irish Sea world that Murtoch controlled would also have been the Rins, i.e. the Rins of Galloway, and possibly more of the territory that we now think of as Galloway would have been in some way subject in this way. So it may also be that the rise of the dynasty of Fergus of Galloway is related to these changes in some way as well. So I think what we see here very clearly is that David's period as dominating the northwest of England also extended much further afield into the Irish Sea. And I think that the absolute boringness of Olaf Bittling's reign is a real tribute to the stability that first Henry and then David's domination of the region brought to the region, which is unparalleled. There's never any other 40-year period of peace of that sort in the Kingdom of the Isles. Thank you very much.